The autumn light is dying over a great estate in the Hudson Valley, gold draining from the eastern lawn until only the windows hold any fire. Move closer past the tall glass. Inside a long walnut table, 12 guests. Candlelight roasted lamb, a string quartet playing something soft and old, closer still, to the head of the table. An old man with a silver beard lifts his wine glass to make a quiet toast, 71 years old, calm, certain. Master of everything this house contains, and then a voice, a boy's voice. Low near his elbow, almost lost beneath the music. Look under the table, sir. The glass stops halfway to his lips. The man does not move. But something has just gone very wrong in a room where everything still looks perfect. The flowers, the candles, the smiling faces. One of them knows. One of them is waiting. And beneath the white linen, beneath the polished silver, a single red light has begun, very patiently, to blink.
Look under the table, sir. The boy's voice came from somewhere near Augustus Thorne's left elbow, low enough that the string quartet on the far side of the room nearly covered it, but clear enough that Gus heard every word. He had been lifting his wine glass to make a quiet toast to the man across from him, a banker named Halloran who had flown in from Denver that afternoon to discuss the sale of a copper mine in Arizona. His hand stopped halfway to his lips. He turned his head slightly. A boy of perhaps 11 years old stood beside his chair, holding a small silver pitcher of water, as if he were one of the catering staff. He was not. Gus Thorne knew every face that worked the formal dining room at Thorne Hall, and he had never seen this child before. The boy was thin in the way that boys are thin when they have spent more days outside than in, and his black uniform jacket was a size too large at the shoulders. His eyes were lowered toward the centerpiece, but Gus could see they were not looking at the centerpiece at all. They were looking very carefully at nothing in particular. "Excuse me," Gus said, keeping his voice at the same easy register he had been using all evening. The boy did not look up. He leaned forward to refill Gus's already full glass, the gesture small and ordinary, and as he did, he spoke again, even quieter than before. "Please, sir, look under the table, not now, after the next course. Drop your napkin." Then he straightened, gave a small bow that Gus was certain no one at this dinner had taught him, and walked silently along the row of guests toward the sideboard at the far end of the room. Gus set his wine glass down. He did so slowly in the same careful way he did everything in front of an audience, because Augustus Thorne had not built one of the largest private mineral holdings in North America by allowing his face to show what his mind was doing. He was 71 years old. His beard had gone silver years ago, trimmed close along a jaw that had been told more lies across more tables than most men hear in a lifetime. He had learned somewhere in his fourth decade that the most dangerous thing a man could do in a room full of money was let his face move. So his face did not move now. The conversation around the table continued without interruption. Halloran was telling a story about a fishing trip in Montana. Gus's daughter-in-law, Adeline, was laughing at the right places. Gus's longtime partner in the firm, a man named Bertram Lowe, was nodding the way he always nodded when he was already thinking about the next sentence he would say. 12 people sat around the long walnut table, and not one of them seemed to have noticed the boy. That fact alone, Gus realized, was the first thing worth noticing. He picked up his wine glass again. He took a small sip. He smiled at Halloran's story without hearing the end of it. Outside the tall windows, the autumn light was failing across the eastern lawn, and the candles on the table had been lit perhaps 20 minutes earlier. The room smelled of beeswax, roasted lamb, and the small white flowers that Adeline had arranged that afternoon in the low silver bowls along the center of the cloth. It was a good room. It was a room Gus had eaten in for 30 years. He knew the way the light moved across the paneling at this hour. He knew the small creak the third floorboard made near the sideboard. He knew which of the candles would gutter first because the draft from the old east window had never quite been sealed, no matter how many men he had paid to seal it. He knew everything about this room. And tonight, for the first time in 30 years, the room did not feel like his. He had built this house when he was 41 years old with the first real money the Arizona ground had ever given him. He had stood on the bare hill where it now sat and watched the foundation poured, and he had thought the way a younger man thinks that a house like this was a kind of fortress, that a man who built thick enough walls and hung heavy enough doors could keep the world's worst things on the far side of them. He had been wrong about that for 30 years, and he had only just now learned it. The next course arrived. 6 servers came through the side door at the same time, each carrying 2 plates, and they moved with the practiced precision that Gus had paid a great deal of money over many years to make appear effortless. The boy was not among them. Gus watched the row of servers carefully without seeming to. None of them looked at the boy. None of them looked for him. It was as if the child had never been in the room at all. He waited. He let the conversation drift for another minute, then two. Bertram made a joke. Adeline refilled her own water glass. Halloran began another story. Gus shifted his weight in his chair, and as he did, the white linen napkin that had been folded across his lap slipped silently down the side of his leg and landed on the parquet floor beside his right shoe. "Pardon me," he said softly to no one in particular. He leaned to the side and reached down. And then, in the small triangle of darkness beneath the table between the legs of his chair and the heavy carved leg of the table itself, Augustus Thorne saw exactly what the boy had wanted him to see. It was a small black device no larger than a deck of cards fastened to the underside of the table with a strip of dark tape. A single red light blinked on its face at a steady, patient rhythm, the way a heartbeat blinks on a hospital monitor when nothing is yet wrong. Beside it, secured against the wood with a second strip of the same tape, was a slim metal cylinder about the length of a pen with two thin wires running from its base into the body of the black device. Gus Thorne had spent 4 decades in the mining business. He had blasted through granite in 3 states. He had paid for, signed for, and stood within 50 feet of more controlled detonations than most soldiers he knew. He recognized what he was looking at within a single second. He recognized something else as well. He recognized that the device had not yet been armed. The red light was a standby light. Whoever had placed it under the table was waiting for a signal to bring it to life, and that signal had not yet come. He picked up the napkin slowly. He sat back up. He laid the napkin across his lap and smoothed it once with his palm. His face did not change. "Halloran," he said, picking up his wineglass again with a steady hand, "you were telling me about the river, the one your boy fell into." Halloran, who had not noticed anything, picked up the thread of his story without missing a beat. Gus nodded along. He smiled at the right moment. He even chuckled once. Inside his chest, his heart was beating with a slow and almost mechanical force that he recognized from other moments in his life. The moment he had been told his first wife had cancer. The moment a shaft had collapsed in the Arizona desert with 16 of his men still inside. The moment his son had called him from a hospital, his voice gone strange and small. It was the heartbeat of a man whose body had understood the situation before his mind had finished cataloging it. A slow, deep, deliberate pounding like a hammer striking deep rock far down in the earth. The kind of blow you feel in the soles of your feet before you ever hear the sound of it. He let his eyes move once around the table, slowly the way a host's eyes move when he is admiring his own dinner party. 12 guests, 3 of them were business. Halloran the banker, Bertram Lowe, his partner of 31 years. A woman named Patricia Vance from the Chicago office who managed the firm's licensing across the western states. 4 of them were family. His son Marcus and Marcus's wife Adeline. His sister Winifred visiting from Seattle. His nephew Desmond, who had joined the firm 2 years earlier in a junior role. 3 were old friends. The Donovans, who had known Gus since before the money, and a retired federal judge named Whitman, who lived 2 estates over. The remaining 2 were Adeline's parents in from Boston for the weekend. 12 people. One of them, Gus understood with a calm that was almost frightening, had either placed the device themselves or knew it was there. Because the boy had said, "Look under the table," not leave the room, not get everyone out. The boy had wanted him to see it. The boy had wanted him to know it was there before whoever planned to arm it had the chance. The boy had wanted him to look at the faces around the table while he still had time to read them. It was when Gus thought about it later, an extraordinary thing for a child to have understood, that the device under the table was a smaller danger than the hand that meant to wake it. That the only way to stop a thing like this was not to run from the room, but to find the face in it that already knew. Gus turned his head slowly, casually toward the sideboard at the far end of the room. The boy was there. He was standing in the small alcove where the catering staff usually waited between courses, pretending to polish a silver tray with a folded cloth. His head was bowed, but Gus saw that the boy's eyes, when they lifted for the briefest second, came directly to his. The boy gave the smallest possible nod. Then he looked back down at the tray. "Augustus," said Adeline from across the table, "are you all right? You looked just for a moment as though you were 1,000 miles away." Gus turned back. He smiled at his daughter-in-law, the small private smile he had reserved for her since the day she first sat at this table 8 years ago, terrified and trying not to show it. She had been 26 then, a schoolteacher's daughter, who had fallen in love with his son and had no idea what it meant to marry into a family with a name on the side of buildings. She had spent that whole first dinner certain she would use the wrong fork, and Gus had quietly used the wrong fork first on purpose, so that whatever she did would be right. He had loved her since that night. He loved her now with a sudden fierceness that frightened him because she was sitting 8 feet from a thing built to tear the room apart. "I was thinking about copper prices," he said. "Forgive an old man with too much on his mind." Halloran laughed. Bertram laughed with him. Adeline shook her head and reached for her water. Gus Thorne picked up his fork. He cut into the lamb with the steady hand of a man who had cut into 1,000 pieces of lamb in this very dining room. He lifted the bite to his mouth. He chewed. He swallowed. He nodded approvingly at Adeline, who had chosen the menu that afternoon, and Adeline smiled back the way she always did when she was pleased he had noticed. But beneath the napkin, beneath the table, beneath the polite scrape of silver against porcelain, his mind was working with a quiet and terrible clarity. The device under the table was not yet armed. That meant someone was waiting. Waiting for what? Waiting for whom? A signal from inside the room or a signal from outside it? A phone. A knock at the door. A particular word spoken by a particular voice across the easy drift of dinner conversation. Gus did not know. But he understood the way he understood the weight of an ore sample by simply holding it in his palm, that whatever the trigger was, it had not yet been pulled. And that meant he had a window. A small one. Perhaps minutes. Perhaps less. He let his eyes drift once more around the table, this time more slowly, the way a man's eyes drift when he is listening to a long story and his attention has begun to wander. He looked at each face. He looked at hands. He looked at where the wine glasses sat. He looked at who was glancing at the door and who was glancing toward the hall and who was glancing at no one at all. Bertram Lowe was talking to Patricia Vance about the third-quarter projections. His hands were on the table, one resting near his wine glass, the other holding his fork. His phone, Gus noted, was not visible. Bertram always kept his phone in his jacket pocket, even at dinner. Gus had teased him about it for 31 years. Patricia Vance had her phone face down beside her plate. She had glanced at it twice in the last 5 minutes. Gus had counted. Marcus, his son, was leaning toward Winifred, laughing at something she had said. His phone was on the sideboard, along with everyone else's, where Adeline had insisted they all be placed at the beginning of the meal. Adeline had a rule about phones at dinner. She enforced it tonight as she enforced it every night. Desmond, his nephew, was sitting very still. He was eating, but he was eating in the slow and careful way that a man eats when he is not actually tasting his food. His eyes were on his plate. He had not laughed at any of Halloran's stories. He had not spoken to anyone in nearly 20 minutes. Gus felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, not yet, but a small, cold pebble of attention dropping into a pool that had until that moment been still. Desmond was 28 years old. He was the son of Gus's late brother, who had died of a heart attack in a hotel room 11 years ago, far from home with no one beside him. Gus had brought Desmond into the firm 2 years earlier as a favor to his sister-in-law, who had raised the boy alone after the funeral, and had asked Gus in the only letter she had ever written him to give her son a place where he might learn to be a man. Desmond had a graduate degree from a good school back east. He was intelligent in the careful, watchful way that some young men are intelligent when they have spent their childhoods listening to adults talk about money they did not yet have. Gus knew that kind of intelligence. He had had it himself once, a long time ago, in a small house with thin walls where a boy learned that money was the thing the adults whispered about after the lights went out. He had been pleasant. He had been competent. He had asked 6 months ago to be given a larger role in the Western operations, and Gus had said he would think about it. Gus had not yet given him an answer. That he understood now with the cold pebble dropping deeper might have been a mistake. Not because the answer should have been yes, but because a young man waiting for an answer is a young man with a door still open in his mind, and there are men in this world who know how to walk through an open door and shut it behind them. Desmond's right hand was not on the table. It was in his lap beneath the linen where Gus could not see it. The hand stayed there. It did not move to lift a fork. It did not move to lift a glass. It simply rested where it could not be observed in the small private dark beneath the cloth. Gus reached for his wine glass again. He took a slow swallow, tasting nothing, his eyes already moving on, because a man who lets his gaze linger is a man whose gaze gets noticed. And as he set the glass down slowly with the care of a man who had learned that slowness was its own kind of strength, a memory rose up in him, unbidden and unwelcome. It was a memory of Bertram Lowe. Four times in the last year and a half, Bertram had come to him about the Arizona mine. 4 times he had sat across a desk and said in that low, careful voice of his that selling the Arizona lode was the one thing the firm could not survive, that it was the only thing keeping the rest of them solvent, that without it, the Western portfolio collapsed, the field offices collapsed, the pensions collapsed. And 4 times Gus had listened with half an ear, the way a tired man listens to a sermon he has heard before, and had said more or less that he was old and he was tired and he wanted out. The first time they had been in Gus's office in the city late the lights of the street 11 floors down. Bertram had laid out the numbers, the way he always laid out numbers, slow and patient, and at the end of it, he had said, "Augustus, if you sell Arizona, you are not selling a mine. You are selling the floor every other man in this firm is standing on." And Gus had said something about being tired of standing on floors. He had thought it was a good line. He remembered being a little proud of it. The second time had been worse. Bertram had not brought numbers. He had brought only himself, and he had sat in the leather chair across the desk and said quietly, "I have given 30 years to this. I am asking you not to take the last 2 from me." And Gus had said he would think about it the way a man says he will think about it when he has already stopped thinking about it. He had thought it was complaining. He had thought it was the ordinary grumbling of a partner 2 years from retirement, frightened of the cliff edge the way all men are frightened of it when they can finally see it. He had not thought it was anything more than that. He pushed the memory down. It was not yet time for it. A memory he had learned was a tool like any other, and a tool brought out too early was a tool that could cut the hand that held it. He needed to move. He understood send all of them on errands without giving the game away. He could not stand up and announce that the room was to be cleared. The moment Desmond, or whoever Desmond was working for, or whoever was working through Desmond, understood that Gus had seen the device, the signal would come. The signal would come fast. He needed another way. He needed to start with the ones he loved. He turned to Adeline, who was seated to his right. He laid his fingertips lightly on her wrist, the gesture of an affectionate father-in-law, and she turned to him at once with the bright, open attention she always gave him. "My dear," he said quietly, "would you do something for me?" "Of course." "I left a small velvet box on the desk in my study, a blue one. It holds a brooch that belonged to my mother." His voice did not waver. "I had meant to give it to your mother tonight after dinner as a thank you for coming all this way. Would you slip out and bring it down quietly? I don't want to spoil the surprise." Adeline's face softened. She loved his mother's jewelry. She had loved it from the first time he had ever opened the drawer and shown her what was inside and told her the small stories that came with each piece, because the stories were the only part of the jewelry that mattered. The brooch with the missing stone his mother had refused to repair because the stone had fallen out the day his father proposed, and she liked the gap where it had been. The thin gold ring she had worn cleaning other people's houses for 30 years. "Of course," she said. "I'll go now." "Take your time. The lamb's too good to rush back to." She squeezed his hand. She rose. She crossed the room with the easy grace that had been hers since the night Marcus first brought her home, and she slipped through the tall double doors into the front hall. As soon as she was gone, Gus turned his head very slightly toward the sideboard. The boy was still there, polishing the same silver tray. There was no box on the desk in the study. There never had been. But the study was at the back of the house on the opposite side from the dining room, and the route to it took Adeline past the kitchen, past the back hallway, past the discreet side door that the catering staff used to come and go. Once she was in that wing of the house, she would be out of the range of whatever the device under the table was meant to do. Whatever else happened tonight, Adeline would not be in this room when it happened. That much at least Gus had now arranged. 1. He let his breath out slowly through his nose the way he had learned to breathe a long time ago in a dusty field office in the Arizona heat, the first time a deal had gone wrong in a way that could have gotten a man killed. Breathe slow. Think slower. Let the other man rush. That had been the lesson of his whole life in the end. The men who lost were the men who hurried. The earth never hurried. The earth had been making copper for 1 billion years and was in no rush to give it up, and a man who wanted it had to learn the earth's patience or die of his own impatience trying. Gus had learned it young, and it had made him rich, and tonight it might be the only thing that kept the people he loved alive. He picked up his fork again. He cut another piece of lamb he had no intention of eating. He chewed it the way a man chews when 12 people are watching, and only one of them knows that the floor has fallen out from under the world. Across the table, Desmond had still not moved his right hand. And in the small, private dark beneath the cloth, Augustus Thorne understood that whatever his nephew's hand was resting on the boy was holding it the way a man holds a thing he has been told to wait beside. The way a man holds a thing he is afraid of. The way a man holds a thing he has not yet decided whether he can go through with. That last thought stayed with Gus longer than the others, because there had been a hesitation in his nephew all evening. A heaviness. The boy was not eating, was not laughing, was not speaking, and a man fully committed to a terrible thing does not always look like that. Sometimes a man fully committed to a terrible thing is the most charming man at the table because the performance is part of how he keeps from looking at what he is about to do. The ones who go quiet are sometimes the ones still arguing with themselves. Gus filed that away. It might mean nothing. It might mean everything. He looked at the candles. He looked at the small white flowers. He looked at the faces of the people he loved, lit gold and soft, in a room that smelled of beeswax and roasted lamb, and the last warmth of an autumn evening that none of them knew was different from any other. And he thought, with the slow clarity of a man who has spent his whole life reading stone, that the most dangerous part of any collapse was never the moment the rock gave way. It was the long, quiet moment just before, the moment when everything still looked solid, the moment when the only sound was the steady, patient ticking of something that had not yet begun to fall. The next person he had to move was his sister. Gus did not look at her right away. He had learned over a long life of difficult rooms that the worst thing a man could do when he needed something was to look as though he needed it. So he let a full minute pass. He let Halloran finish his story about the river. He laughed at the end of it, a real laugh this time, or close enough that no one could have told the difference. Then, almost as an afterthought, the way a host remembers some small forgotten thing, he turned toward Winifred, who was seated 3 places down on his left, and raised his voice just enough to carry. "Winnie," he said warmly, "before I forget, there's a letter for you in the front hall. Came this morning. From the lawyer in Seattle, I think." Winifred looked up from her plate. "It looked important," Gus went on. "I had Dolores set it on the table by the front door so you wouldn't miss it on your way out. Might be worth a look now before we get into the dessert and the coffee and the whole evening runs away from us." Winifred gave him the small, affectionate exasperation of an older sister, though she was the younger one and they both knew it. "Augustus, it can wait." "It came certified," Gus said. "I signed for it myself. The fellow at the door said it was time sensitive. I wouldn't say a word if I didn't think it mattered." Winifred hesitated. There was a part of him even now, even in the middle of all of it, that ached at how easily she believed him. Winifred had believed him his whole life. She was the little sister who had watched him leave home at 17 to work the mines, who had read his letters out loud to their mother when their mother's eyes had failed, who had never once in 70 years had a reason to doubt a single word that came out of his mouth. He was using that now. He was spending her trust like a coin to get her out of a room she did not know she needed to leave. He told himself he would explain it to her later. He told himself she would forgive him. Both things were true, and neither made it feel any cleaner. She glanced toward the doors. Then she set down her fork. "Very well," she said. "I'll just have a quick look. Save my place." She rose. She walked out of the dining room toward the front hall, leaving her wineglass half full and her plate half eaten. There was no letter on the table by the front door. Gus had never received any such letter. But the front hall was on the far side of the house from the dining room, and the front hall had heavy doors that could be closed. And Dolores, who ran the household, was always somewhere near the front of the house at this hour of the evening. Winifred would find Dolores. Winifred would ask about the letter. Dolores would be confused. The conversation would take time, and Winifred would not be in this room. 2. Gus reached for his wine again. He let the glass touch his lips and set it back down untouched. Across the table, Desmond had not moved. His left hand was on the table now, resting near his plate, still and pale. But his right hand was still in his lap beneath the linen where it had been since the boy first whispered in Gus's ear. And now his right hand had drifted slightly, and Gus could see by the small tension in his nephew's shoulder that the hand was resting on something. His knuckles, what little Gus could see of them at the edge of the cloth, were faintly white. Gus thought very calmly, very precisely. He is waiting for something. He is not the one who will send the signal. He is the one who is waiting to receive it. That changed everything. If Desmond was not the trigger, then the trigger was elsewhere. Possibly outside the room. Possibly outside the house. Possibly outside the property entirely. A phone call, a text, a timer. Something that would arrive without warning, something Desmond had been told to wait for, something Desmond had been told to do something about. Do what exactly Gus did not know, but he could guess. Desmond's hand was in his lap. Desmond's hand was almost certainly resting on a phone set to silent, a phone whose screen would light up the moment the signal came. And then Desmond would do one of two things. He would send a return signal confirming that the room was as it should be. Or he would press something on his own phone, and the red light under the table would stop being a standby light and would become something else entirely. Gus set down his wine glass. He needed to know what was on that phone. He needed to know without Desmond ever suspecting he had looked. And he needed to get his nephew away from this table before whatever was coming came. He let his eyes move once briefly toward the sideboard. The boy was no longer polishing the tray. The boy was standing very still, his hands folded in front of him. His eyes lifted now, watching Gus directly across the length of the long room. Gus met his gaze for the briefest moment. He gave with the smallest movement of his head an almost imperceptible nod. The boy understood. It struck Gus in the half-second it took the boy to understand how strange a thing they were doing together. He did not know this child's name. He had never spoken more than a passing word to him in his life. And yet across the length of a candlelit room, the two of them were carrying out a silent conversation in a language neither had been taught, a language made entirely of glances and small movements of the head, and the boy was reading him as cleanly as Bertram ever had in 31 years. There are people in this world, Gus thought, who are simply awake, who see. The boy was one of them. He had probably been one of them his whole short life in rooms where no one had ever once looked back at him. The boy left the alcove. He walked along the side of the room behind the chairs in the unhurried way that a well-trained server walks when he is on an ordinary errand. He carried a small silver pitcher of water. He stopped behind Desmond's chair. He leaned forward to refill Desmond's nearly full glass, and as he leaned, his elbow caught the back of Desmond's chair. The pitcher tipped. A small, cold cascade of ice water poured directly into Desmond's lap. Desmond leapt up with a sharp, involuntary cry. His chair scraped backward across the parquet with a sound that cut through every conversation at the table. Water was running down the front of his trousers, soaking through the gray wool pooling on the seat of the chair behind him. He cursed, caught himself, looked around at the suddenly silent table, and went red to the ears. "I am so sorry, sir," the boy said at once, his voice small and stricken in the way that only the voice of a frightened child can be. "I'm so sorry. The pitcher slipped. I'm so sorry." "It's fine," Desmond said tightly. "It's fine. It's fine." But his right hand had come up automatically when he leapt, and his left hand, the hand that had been resting near his plate, had come up with it. And something small and dark fell from his lap with a soft, sharp clatter onto the parquet floor between his feet. It was a phone, a black phone, slim, expensive, the screen face down. For one long second, no one moved. Desmond looked down at the phone. The boy, still holding the half-empty pitcher, looked down at the phone. And Gus Thorne, from his place at the head of the table, looked at the phone as well. And then, in the small, frozen instant before Desmond could react, Gus saw something else. He saw that Desmond's eyes, when they came back up from the phone, did not go to the boy. They did not go to his soaked trousers. They did not go to Gus. They went to Bertram Lowe. It was the briefest possible glance. A flicker. The kind of glance a man gives without meaning, to the kind that escapes him before he can stop it, when something has gone wrong, and he is looking by pure reflex to the only other person in the room who knows that something can go wrong. Bertram did not return the glance. Bertram was looking with apparent concern at Desmond's ruined trousers, and Gus Thorne felt the small, cold pebble in his chest grow very quietly into a small, cold stone. He had known Bertram Lowe for 31 years. He had known the way the man held a pen, the way he cleared his throat before he said something. He had rehearsed the way he laughed half a beat late when a joke had caught him off guard. He knew Bertram the way a man knows the road home, the way a man knows a thing so well he has stopped seeing it. And he had not seen this. For 18 months he had not seen it. There was a particular kind of grief in that, separate from everything else, and Gus felt it move through him like cold water finding the cracks in warm rock. It was the grief of a man learning that his own eyes, the eyes he had trusted his whole life, the eyes that could read a vein of ore through 40 feet of dead stone, had been looking straight at the most important thing in his world and had seen nothing at all. Desmond, Gus said gently, go on upstairs and change. Use the guest room at the end of the second floor hall. There's a set of clothes in the closet that should fit you well enough. I keep them for when a guest has an accident. Take your time. Dolores can have your trousers cleaned by morning. Sir, I'm so sorry. Nonsense. It's only water. Go on. The dinner can wait. Desmond hesitated. His eyes, just for a fraction of a second, flicked down toward the phone on the floor. He began almost imperceptibly to lean toward it. The boy was faster. Let me, sir, the boy said, and crouched and picked up the phone and held it out toward Desmond with both hands. I'm so very sorry, sir. Let me dry it for you. I'll make sure it isn't damaged, and I'll bring it up to your room in just a moment. Desmond reached for the phone. His fingers closed around it. And for one moment, the boy did not let go. The two of them, the young man in his soaked gray wool and the thin child in his oversized black jacket, stood gripping the small black phone in the silence of the dining room. And in that moment, Gus understood that the boy was buying something. Time, or a look at the screen, or simply the chance to make Desmond's hands shake by holding on a half-second longer than was natural, long enough to plant a small seed of doubt in a man who was already full of doubt. Whatever it was, the boy was buying it with a courage that made Gus's chest ache. Then the boy released it. He bowed slightly. He stepped back. Desmond put the phone into the inside pocket of his jacket. He nodded once at Gus. He turned and walked out of the dining room, his trousers leaving a small dark trail of water along the parquet. Gus waited until his nephew's footsteps had faded up the main staircase. 3. Then he let himself feel it just for a moment, just for the length of a single slow breath. Because the boy had been quick and the boy had been brave, but the phone had gone up the stairs in Desmond's jacket pocket, and whatever was on that phone, Gus had not seen it. He had seen the glance, though. He had seen where his nephew's eyes had gone in the one unguarded instant of his life, and that was worth more than any phone. A phone could be wiped. A phone could be locked. A phone could be thrown into a river. But the glance had told Gus the one thing the phone never could, which was the direction the rot ran. It did not run from Desmond outward. It ran from Bertram inward. The boy upstairs was not the architect of this. He was a tool in another man's hand, the way Gus's nephew had always been a tool in someone's hand, first his grief, then his poverty, and now finally this. Gus reached for his wine. The conversation around the table had begun to recover the way conversation does, after a small embarrassment, everyone pretending a little too hard that nothing had happened. The Donovans started a new thread about the difficulty of the drive up from the city. Patricia Vance said something dry to the judge. Adeline's mother laughed. The dinner closed over the gap left by Desmond like water closing over a stone dropped into a still pond. And in the quiet beneath it, Gus let the memory rise again. This time he did not push it down. He let himself remember Bertram Lowe. He remembered a younger man, lean and sharp-eyed, standing beside him in the rain at his first wife's funeral, holding an umbrella over Gus's head and not saying a word because there were no words. And Bertram had always known the difference between silence that comforted and silence that did not. Gus had stood at the edge of that grave, unable to move, and it had been Bertram's hand on his elbow, steady and certain that, had finally turned him and walked him back to the car. They had not spoken the whole drive. They had not needed to. He remembered the night the shaft collapsed in the Arizona desert, 16 men trapped in the dark beneath 1,000 tons of rock, and the phone ringing at 3 in the morning, and Bertram's voice on the line saying only, "I'm already in the car." And he had been. He had driven 4 hours through the desert in the dark to stand beside Gus at the mouth of that shaft, and he had not left until the last man was out. Gus could still see him, gray with dust and exhaustion, standing in the first light of dawn, as the 16th man came up on the cable alive. And Bertram had not cheered, had not wept, had only put his hand flat against the rock face for a moment, the way a man touches the flank of an animal that has nearly killed him, and chosen this time not to. He remembered 1997, the worst year the firm had ever seen, a payroll that nearly failed, men with families waiting on checks that the bank would not cover. And Bertram Lowe, without being asked, without a word about it then or ever again, had wired $500,000 from his own personal accounts to bridge the gap. Gus had paid it back within the year. But the thing Bertram had given him that week could not be paid back, and they had both known it, and neither of them had ever spoken of it. That was the man. That was 31 years. And somewhere in the last 18 months of those years, that man had sat across a desk from him 4 separate times and tried to tell him the truth in the only language he had left, and Gus had not listened. "I am old," Gus had said. "I am tired. I want out." And Bertram had looked at him those 4 times with an expression Gus had taken for ordinary worry. He understood now that it had not been worry. It had been the look of a man watching a door close that he could not afford to let close. The look of a man doing the arithmetic of his own ruin, the long subtraction of everything he had built year by year, down to a number that left his sick wife and his 2 grandchildren standing in the cold. Gus felt no rage. That was the strange thing. That was the thing he knew he would turn over in his hands for the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. He felt no rage and no shock. He felt only a vast and almost geological sadness. The sadness of a man who had spent his whole life reading stone, watching a long shelf of rock that he had always believed was solid begin finally to crack along a seam he had never seen. He set down his wineglass. It was time. He could not sit at this table for another hour, smiling at Halloran, waiting for a signal he could not predict to arrive from a direction he could not name. The window the boy had given him was closing. He could feel it closing the way he could feel weather coming in over the mountains long before the first cloud showed. He had to end it. And to end it, he had to be alone in a room with the one man at this table who knew what was under it. Gus turned without turning his head too far and spoke softly across the table to his partner. "Bertram," he said, "do you remember the name of that little place outside Santa Fe? The one with the blue door and the old woman who made the green cello?" Bertram looked up from his conversation with Patricia, slightly puzzled by the sudden turn. "Santa Fe," he said. "The blue door. You mean the place off the old plaza. The woman who wouldn't take a reservation no matter who you were. That's the one. I can't for the life of me remember what it was called." "La Casa Vieja," Bertram said. "Why, you thinking of going back?" "I might be," Gus said mildly. "I might be thinking of a great many things." He smiled at Bertram, and Bertram, who had known him for 31 years, who understood his old friend's face better than any other man alive, smiled back. But not quite with the same warmth. Something had moved behind Gus's eyes. Something Bertram had seen only a handful of times in 3 decades. He did not know yet what it was, but he had been Augustus Thorne's partner long enough to know that when that particular expression appeared, the wisest thing a man could do was wait and watch and say nothing he had not already planned to say. Bertram nodded. He picked up his glass. He turned his attention deliberately back to Patricia, but his right hand, which had been resting on the table, slid down to his lap. And a moment later, Gus saw the small bulge of Bertram's jacket pocket shift very slightly. Bertram had remembered just then exactly where his phone was, and he had remembered just then that he might want it within easy reach. Gus felt a small, private, terrible gratitude that 31 years of working beside the same man had built between them a language that needed no words. The trouble was that the language ran both ways. That was the thing about a man who knows you completely. The same knowledge that lets him finish your sentences lets him read your hand at cards. Bertram had not survived 3 decades in the mineral business by being slow, and he had not arranged 18 months of patient murder by being careless. He had seen the boy spill the water. He had seen the phone fall. He had seen the glance Desmond gave him, the same glance Gus had seen. And now he had seen the thing move behind Gus's eyes. He was at this moment running the same arithmetic Gus was running and arriving at the same total, and the only question left was which of them would move first and how. Gus let the table settle for another minute. He let Halloran pour himself more wine. He let the judge tell the end of a story Gus did not hear. And then, with the unhurried ease of a man rising from his own table, in his own house, the most natural thing in the world, Gus laid his napkin beside his plate and stood. "Bertram," he said, "would you give me a private word in the library? Small piece of business that won't keep." The room did not stop. Why would it? A man asking his partner for a word at his own dinner table was the least remarkable thing that could happen in that house. But Bertram Lowe hesitated. He hesitated for exactly 1 second. 1 second in which Gus watched his oldest friend run the whole length of it in his mind. The phone in his pocket. The boy who had spilled the water. The phone that had fallen from Desmond's lap. The glance Desmond had not meant to give. The expression that had moved behind Gus's eyes. All of it weighed and measured in a single second by a man who had spent his life weighing and measuring. And at the end of that second, Bertram Lowe made the only calculation left to him. He understood that the signal had not gone out that Desmond was upstairs and out of reach, that his own phone in his pocket was the last live wire in the room, and that the moment he reached for it in front of 12 people, the game was finished anyway. He understood that there was no version of the next 60 seconds in which a 68-year-old man drew a phone and sent a text across a dinner table without being seen. The window had been his, and it had closed, and the man who had closed it was standing over him now with a napkin folded by his plate, asking him for a word. He smiled, the small, dry smile of a man who had just understood that there was no graceful way left to refuse. "Of course, Augustus," he said. He set his napkin beside his plate. He stood. "Halloran, you'll forgive us. A small thing that can't wait until the brandy. We'll be 5 minutes." Halloran waved a hand and reached for the wine. Gus turned and walked at his usual measured pace toward the side door that led to the library. Bertram followed. And as Gus passed the sideboard, he caught the boy's eye for the briefest moment. He did not nod. He did not signal. He simply looked. And the boy looked back. And a small and complete understanding passed between them. An old man of 71 and a child of 11 that needed no motion at all to be spoken. The library was 3 doors down a paneled hallway. Gus opened the door. He stepped inside. He held it for Bertram. Bertram entered. And Gus Thorne closed the door behind them, and the sound of the dinner fell away. And the two of them stood alone at last in a long, quiet room full of books, with a fire burning low in the marble hearth, and 31 years standing between them like a third man in the room. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire ticked. A log settled. Somewhere far off in the house, faint through the heavy door, the string quartet had begun something slow. Then Gus crossed to the hearth and looked into the low flame and felt the warmth of it on the side of his bearded face and did not turn around. "How long?" he said quietly. "Have you been planning this?" Bertram Lowe did not pretend. That was, Gus thought, the one mercy of dealing with a man you had known for 31 years. He did not pretend. He did not reach for the wide-eyed confusion of an innocent man. He did not ask what on earth Gus could possibly mean. He looked across the long, quiet room at his oldest friend, and his face was tired and old and almost relieved. The face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was in some strange way Gus would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, glad to finally set it down. 18 months, Bertram said. Gus absorbed this. He had known it would be a long time. He had known it the moment he saw the device, the moment he understood that something fastened with that much patience to the underside of his own table had not been the work of a single afternoon. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and hearing a man say it out loud. 18 months, a year and a half, birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays. 18 months of sitting across desks from Gus, of shaking his hand, of laughing at his jokes, of asking after his health, of carrying inside him, the whole time the shape of the day his oldest friend would die. "Why?" Gus said. It was the only question that mattered, and he asked it plainly the way he asked everything plainly because he was too old and too tired for any other way. "You were going to sell to Halloran," Bertram said. "You were going to sell Arizona." He said it the way a man names a wound. "You were going to take the money and walk away and leave the rest of us to manage what was left. And what was left would not have been worth managing, and you know that as well as I do. The Arizona load is the only thing keeping the rest of the firm solvent for the next 10 years. Without it, the Western portfolio collapses. The field offices collapse. Half the men out there lose their pensions." He took a breath. "And I lose everything I built alongside you. Because I am 2 years from retirement, Augustus, and my stake in this firm is the only stake I have." "You could have come to me," Gus said. "I came to you 4 times. The words landed flat in the quiet room without anger, which made them worse. "You did not listen." You wanted out. You said you were tired. I am tired, Gus said. Yes, Bertram said. And I am 68, and my wife is sick, Augustus. You know she is sick, and I have 2 grandchildren in school I'm helping to put there, and I could not afford to be tired. Gus looked at him for a long time. He looked at the man who had stood beside him in the rain at his first wife's funeral. He looked at the man who had driven 4 hours through the desert in the dark when the shaft collapsed and had not left the mouth of it until the last of the 16 was carried out. He looked at the man who had wired $500,000 from his own accounts in the worst year of Gus's life and had never once spoken of it after. He looked at all of it, and the sadness he felt now was different from the geological sadness at the table. That had been the slow grief of a thing first cracking. This was the grief of a thing already broken, lying in pieces on the floor between them, past the point where any reading of the stone could matter. There was nothing left to study in it. The seam had failed, the shelf was down. All that remained was the long, quiet work of clearing the rubble, and the knowledge that the space it had filled would now be empty for the rest of his life. Desmond, Gus said. My brother's boy, he couldn't have done this alone. It was not a question. Bertram did not insult him by treating it as one. He needed the money, Bertram said. His mother needs the money. He came to me a year ago asking for more than the firm could give him. I gave him a way to get it. He was the one at the table. He was the one who would wait for the signal. He was the one who would make sure no one bumped the chair before the time came. And the signal, Gus said. Where was it coming from? From me, Bertram said simply. A text from my phone. Once Halloran had finished his copper, once the papers were close, once you were past the point of changing your mind, I would have stepped out for the men's room. I would have sent it from the hall. The device under the table would have woken up, and 9 seconds later it would have done what it was built to do. Gus was silent for a moment. The fire moved softly in the hearth behind him. It was never going to kill all of you, Bertram said, and for the first time his voice gentled, as though that were a thing that might matter, as though it were a mercy he wanted credit for. It was placed at your end of the table. The shaped charge points up and forward toward your chair. The blast radius is small. Halloran, perhaps, if he was unlucky. Possibly me, depending on where I was when it went. Everyone else would have walked away with cut faces and a story to tell for the rest of their lives. He took a slow breath. The investigators would have found a faulty gas line in the cellar. They would not have looked for anything else. I made certain of that. I have spent 18 months making certain of that. So do not insult either of us, Augustus, by asking whether I was serious. Gus turned finally from the fire. He looked at his partner across the small round table between the 2 leather chairs, and the firelight moved on the silver of his beard, and his eyes were very steady and very old. Who else, he said. No one else at the table, Bertram said. Desmond, myself, and a man you have never met who built the device and asked no questions. That is all. I did not bring anyone else into it. I am not a stupid man. No, Gus said. You are not. He walked then slowly around the small round table. He did not approach Bertram. He walked instead to the heavy wooden desk against the far wall, and he opened the top drawer and he took from it a small black object. It was a phone. It was not his usual phone. It was a second one, plain and unremarkable, that he had kept in that drawer for nearly 3 years for reasons that had until tonight remained entirely theoretical. He pressed a single key. Detective Harlan, he said, this is Augustus Thorne. I am in the library at Thorne Hall. Bertram went very still. There is a device beneath the dining room table, Gus said into the phone, his voice as level as if he were ordering a car brought around. It is not yet armed. The man who arranged it is standing across from me. The man who was meant to wait for the signal is upstairs in the second-floor guest room and is almost certainly drying a phone. I would be grateful if you would come now. Quietly. The house is full of guests, and most of them do not know that anything is wrong. He listened for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he ended the call. He set the phone back into the drawer. He slid the drawer closed. He turned around. Bertram had not moved. You called them already, Bertram said. It was not a question. A few minutes ago, Gus said, Just after I picked up my glass again after I dropped my napkin and seen what was under the table, there was a single button on the side of the phone in my jacket pocket. One press. No screen, no number to dial, nothing for anyone to see. I had it built 3 years ago. He watched the understanding move across his old friend's face. I have never used it before tonight, Gus said. 3 years ago, I sat in this room and I thought to myself, I am a wealthy man with a great many partners and a great many enemies, and someday one of them will surprise me. So I made an arrangement. A quiet one. A retainer no one knew about. A team that has stayed within a few minutes of this house every night for 3 years, waiting for a call that I prayed would never come. He paused. I pressed that button the moment I sat back up from the floor, before I picked up my wine, before I spoke another word to anyone in that room. While you were still telling Patricia about the third quarter, the call was already going out. I had simply hoped foolishly in the seconds before I pressed it that when the day finally came, the man across this table from me would not be you. Bertram Lowe's face did not change, but something in his shoulders gave way. Some last load-bearing thing inside him, some beam that had held him upright through 18 months of carrying this finally cracked and settled. He reached behind himself for the leather chair, and he sat down in it heavily the way an old man sits when his legs have stopped agreeing to hold him. He looked at his own hands resting on his knees. How did you know, he said. Even with the button, even with all of it. The device was hidden. Desmond was careful. You should not have known to drop your napkin. How did you know tonight of all nights? Gus considered the question. He considered the boy at the sideboard. He considered the small silver pitcher. He considered the quiet voice at his elbow, no louder than a whisper, telling him to look under the table. A child told me, he said. Bertram looked up. A boy, Gus said. 11 years old. He is in my dining room at this moment, polishing a silver tray and pretending that the most important thing he has ever done is not the thing he did half an hour ago. I don't understand, Bertram said. No, Gus said quietly. You wouldn't. You have lived among the wrong sort of people for too long, Bertram. You have forgotten what they look like. The kind of person who notices what no one else notices, and who is brave enough when it matters to speak. You and I, we stopped being those people a long time ago. We learned to look at a room and see only the angles in it. He looked at the same room and saw a man who was about to die. The door to the library opened. Detective Harlan entered without knocking. She was a compact woman with iron gray hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had walked calmly into a great many rooms that other people were running out of. Behind her came two plainclothes officers and a third figure in a dark windbreaker carrying a small hard case of tools. They had come through the side entrance of the property. Gus understood the way he had instructed them to come 3 years ago if the call ever arrived. The dining room, Gus said quietly. The device is beneath the head of the table, fastened to the underside with dark tape. It is not armed. The nephew is upstairs, second-floor guest room with the phone he was meant to use. He does not yet know that the signal is never coming. Harlan nodded once and was gone. The figure in the windbreaker followed her, moving toward the dining room with the small, contained urgency of a person who had spent a great many years walking slowly toward things that other people fled. The two remaining officers stayed in the library. One stood beside the door. The other stood beside Bertram's chair. Bertram did not look up at him. Gus walked back to the small round table and laid both his hands flat on its surface. He stood like that for a long moment, looking down at the grain of the wood, the small whorls and knots and veins that had been there for 200 years before he was born and would be there for 200 years after he was gone. What will happen to my brother's boy? Bertram said quietly. That is not for me to decide, Gus said. It is for the courts. He is 28 years old. He is old enough. His mother, Gus said, raised him alone after his father died, and she did her best. And her best was not enough to keep him from sitting at my table with a phone in his lap, waiting for permission to kill me. He let that sit in the quiet room. That is not her fault, he said. And it is not mine. It is his, Bertram. And it is yours. You found a grieving boy who needed money, and you taught him that the way to get it was to murder the man who gave him his name. Whatever the court does to him, you will have to carry that. I hope his mother never learns your part in it. For her sake, not for yours." Bertram was silent. "You will lose everything," Gus said. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man reads a verdict aloud because someone must, and because it is worse to leave it unsaid. "The firm, the pension, the grandchildren in school. Your wife will hear about it from a reporter tomorrow morning before she has finished her coffee. There is no version of the next 6 months that does not contain a great deal of pain for everyone you love." He drew a breath. "I want you to understand that I did not arrange that pain. You arranged it 18 months ago at whatever desk you sat at when you first let yourself think the thought all the way through. I am only the man who happened to survive long enough to watch it begin." Bertram lifted his head finally and looked at him. "I'm sorry, Augustus," he said. "Yes," Gus said. "I believe you are. That is one of the things I am going to have to carry for the rest of my life. That you could be sorry and could mean it and could still have built that thing and bolted it under my table with your own 2 hands. I have spent my whole life believing that a man was one thing or another. You have taught me tonight that a man can be both. I would have been happier never knowing it." He walked past the chair. He walked past the officer beside the door. He walked out of the library and down the paneled hallway and back toward the warm gold light of the dining room. But the dining room was no longer full. The guests had been moved quietly and without panic into the garden room at the back of the house. Gus could see them through the open doors at the far end, gathered in small, confused clusters, holding their wine glasses, asking one another in low voices what on earth was happening. Adeline was among them, holding her mother's hand. Winifred was beside her, the letter that did not exist forgotten entirely. Marcus was on his phone, his face tight, and when he saw his father in the doorway across the long room, something in his shoulders came loose all at once. And Gus understood that his son had spent the last several minutes not knowing whether the man who raised him was alive. Halloran was standing at a window with the patient expression of a man who had been in a great many places where things went sideways and who had learned long ago that the wisest thing to do was wait. The dining room itself was empty now, except for the technician beneath the table and a single uniformed officer standing near the door. The technician was working with small, steady hands. The red light Gus had seen blinking with such patient menace had stopped blinking. It was no longer lit at all. And the boy was still at the sideboard. He had set down the silver tray. He was standing with his hands folded in front of him, looking very small in the oversized black jacket, looking very young in the candlelight that still moved softly along the paneled walls. Gus crossed the room and stopped in front of him. "What is your name?" Gus said quietly. "Theo, sir." "Theo," Gus said. "Yes, sir." Gus knelt down slowly the way he had not knelt in many years until his eyes were level with the boy's. His knees protested. He ignored them. There were some things in this world that a man did on his knees or did not do at all, and looking a brave child in the eye was one of them. "How did you know Theo?" he said. The boy looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up. "The man upstairs," he said. "Mr. Desmond. He came into the kitchen this afternoon to ask the cook for something. He didn't see me. I was in the pantry behind the door. He was on his phone talking to someone." The boy's voice was steady, but only just. "He said the table was ready. He said the signal would come once the dinner was far along. He said to make sure nobody bumped his chair before then, because the device was small and the trigger was on his phone, and if somebody jostled him at the wrong moment, he might send it early by accident." "And you understood," Gus said. "I didn't understand all of it, sir, but I understood enough. I understood that something terrible was going to happen at this table tonight, and I understood that you were the man who would be sitting at the head of it." Gus looked at him. "I've seen you before, sir," the boy said. "You walk in the garden sometimes in the mornings. You said good morning to me once last spring. I was helping the gardener carry bags of soil. You looked right at me and you said good morning like I was somebody." Gus did not remember it. He found suddenly and completely that this was almost unbearable to him. That on some ordinary morning last spring he had said 2 words to a child carrying bags of soil. 2 words he had forgotten before he reached the end of the garden path, and that those 2 words had been enough. Enough to make this boy decide this very afternoon that the man at the head of the table was worth the risk of his own small life. He thought of all the careful things he had done that evening, the errands invented for Adeline and Winifred, the story about the blue door in Santa Fe, The hidden button built 3 years before by men he had paid handsomely to imagine exactly this. All of it, every clever piece of it, had only worked because a boy he did not remember had once been told good morning and had decided that meant something. "Why didn't you go to someone?" Gus said. "The cook, my household manager, anyone." "I didn't know who else was helping him, sir," the boy said. "I didn't know who I could trust. I only knew that I could find a way to be in this room tonight because the caterer was a man short, and they asked the kitchen if anyone had a son old enough to carry pitchers. My uncle works in the kitchen. He said yes for me before I could even open my mouth. I borrowed the jacket from his nephew. It's too big." He looked down at the jacket, ashamed. "I'm sorry, sir." "Do not be sorry," Gus said. His voice had gone low and rough. "Do not ever, as long as you live, be sorry for the size of the jacket you wore tonight." The boy did not understand. Gus did not yet have the words to explain it to him. He thought perhaps that he would find them in time. That over the coming years, of which Gus intended to make sure this boy had a great many good ones, he would find a way to tell him what it had meant. That a child too small for his borrowed coat had stood at a sideboard with a silver tray in his hands and changed the ending of an old man's life. "Theo," Gus said, "where is your mother?" "She works at a laundry, sir, in the city, the night shift. She doesn't know I'm here." "What is her name?" "Maggie, sir. Maggie Whitaker." "And your father?" "He's gone, sir." The boy's voice did not waver, but something in his eyes did. 3 years now. Gus nodded slowly. 3 years. The boy had been 8 when his father died, and Gus's nephew Desmond had been 17 when his own father died in that hotel room far from home. The same wound Gus thought opening in 2 boys a generation apart. One of them had carried it into a kitchen pantry this afternoon and decided to save a stranger's life. The other had carried it to this table tonight and sat down with a phone in his lap to end one. The wound did not decide. The boy decided. That was the whole of it, and it would take Gus the rest of his life to make his peace with how simple and how terrible a thing that was. He laid one hand very gently on the boy's small shoulder. He could feel through the thin, oversized jacket how slight the child was. How easily the whole brave weight of him might have been lost tonight in a blast meant for an old man in a story the world would have explained away as a faulty gas line in a cellar. "Theo," he said, "listen to me carefully now." "Yes, sir." "What you did tonight was the bravest thing anyone has done in this house in 50 years. And I have lived here for 30 of those years, so I know what I'm saying. You saved the life of an old man you did not know. You did it at a risk you could not measure. And you did it for one reason only, because you noticed something, and you refused to look away." The boy's eyes had begun to shine. "Do you understand me?" Gus said. "Yes, sir." "From tonight forward," Gus said, "you are not going to worry about your school. You are not going to worry about your mother's shift at the laundry. You are not going to worry about a jacket that fits. You are going to worry instead about one thing and one thing only. What kind of man you wish to become. Because that is the only thing left for you to decide. Everything else from this night on will be arranged." The boy looked at him for a long moment with eyes that did not yet know how to receive what was being said to them. The eyes of a child who had spent 11 years learning to expect very little, being handed all at once more than he had words for. Then slowly he nodded. Gus stood. His knees complained again louder this time, the way an old man's body always complains when it has been asked twice in one evening to do a thing it would rather not. He did not care. He looked once more around the room. The technician was lifting the small black device free of the underside of the table, now sealing it carefully into a hard case. The candles were still burning low in their holders, the small white flowers still pale and soft in the silver bowls. Through the windows, far down the long gravel drive, the first of the police vehicles had begun to arrive, moving up toward the house without their lights. A quiet procession in the autumn dark. Somewhere in the garden room, Adeline laughed at something, a small, startled laugh, the laugh of a woman letting go of a fear she did not yet fully understand she had been carrying. The sound of it reached Gus across the empty dining room, and it was, he thought, the most beautiful sound he had heard in a very long time. The sound of the people he loved alive and safe and going home tonight. He thought of the years ahead, the trial, the reporters, the long unwinding of the firm, the careful work of keeping the field offices open and the pensions whole, the thing Bertram had been willing to kill to protect, which Gus would now have to find a way to protect without him. He thought of his sister's face when she learned the letter had never existed, and why. He thought of his sister-in-law somewhere across the country who did not yet know that the son she had asked him to raise into a man had instead become this. There would be no easy mornings for a long while. He was 71 years old, and the part of his life that should have been the quiet part was about to become the hardest part, and he knew it. But he was alive to face it, and that tonight was enough. He looked down at the boy one last time. Theo Whitaker stood in his borrowed jacket in the gold and failing candlelight, looking up at the old man with the silver beard, as though he were trying to memorize him. And Augustus Thorne understood something then, with the same slow clarity with which he had once read the weight of stone in the palm of his hand. He had spent his whole life surrounded by powerful men. Men who owned mines and banks, and the men who worked them. Men who could move money across the world with a phone call, who could buy silence, who could arrange the truth into whatever shape suited them. He had sat at tables with all of them. He had trusted one of them for 31 years, and not one of them in the end had saved him. It had been a boy of 11 in a coat that did not fit, who had no power in this world at all, except the power to notice and the power to be afraid and the courage to speak anyway. That Gus thought was the thing he would carry. Not the betrayal, not the device under the table, not the long, sad ruin of a friendship he had believed in. He would carry the boy. He laid his hand once more on Theo's shoulder, and he left it there. And the two of them stood together in the quiet ruin of the evening, the oldest man in the house and the youngest. While outside the tall windows, the cars came up the drive in the dark, and the candles burned low, and the dinner in every way that mattered was finally over. The bravest voices in this world are so often the smallest ones, and they only ever reach the people who need them when someone is willing to help them be heard.